You should be recording it now, hopefully.
Excellent. Yes, I see the record button going.
Okay, I see it's recorded. Thank you, Dax. Sorry about that interruption.
No problems. Okay, so thank you all. So I am Kirsty Tinto. I'm here, like, actually on site at the moment at Lamont-Doherty, part of Columbia, just up the river. And I wanted to give this talk today and talk about all of the aerogeophysical work that we have been doing to try and understand ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. And then I realized that was too much. So I'm going to focus on one particular project, but I will be very happy to take questions or engage in discussion at the end about whatever is in your mind or comes up from here. So this is a study of a full ice shelf system and attacking it every way we know how. So trying to get measurements of the cryosphere from airborne geophysics and also from the sea that underlies the ice shelf. I mentioned the Rosetta-Ice team because it takes a lot of people to do this kind of work, and also to learn how to advance slides. This is a snapshot of who I mean by Rosetta-Ice team. We have collaborators in a lot of different institutions, and a lot of people have been key in bringing this research together. So to stand back and figure out why, what the big questions that we're trying to answer are, we're trying to understand the full system that makes up the major ice sheets, and in this case, Antarctica. So obviously we need to understand the ice that sits on top of the continent, but dear to my heart is an understanding of the rock that the ice sits on and how that controls how ice flows and the stability of the ice sheet that sits on top. So there is a geological component to the work that we're doing here, although I'm not going to emphasize that today. It is steering the shape of that layer that you see in the middle, which is the bedrock topography underneath Antarctica. And then the oceanography is really the thing that stitches those two systems together. So the bedrock steers the circulation of ocean water, which is bringing heat into the grounding line of the ice sheet and really being a critical component in determining ice sheet stability and also transporting and connecting Antarctica to the rest of the world. The specific project that I'm going to talk about is based here. One part of Antarctica, it's the Ross Ice Shelf. It's the biggest ice shelf in Antarctica. So a good place to start if you want to understand some fundamental processes. And in other projects, in IceBridge that was mentioned in the introduction, we have done a lot of flying around West Antarctica. We've done some flying around East Antarctica. In this case, we were able to base our project at McMurdo Station, which is on Ross Island in the Ross Ice Shelf, and we're able to work over this area. I mentioned that the Ross Ice Shelf is the biggest ice shelf in Antarctica, so it's a good place to start. It's also connected to some really major basins. There's 2 meters of sea level equivalent that's locked up in the West Antarctic Basin that flows into the Ross Ice Shelf, and nearly 10 meters of equivalent in the East Antarctic Basin that meets it. So ice shelves kind of work like doorstops, providing buttressing strength to hold back the grounded ice on the ice sheet. And in this case, there's a lot of ice that is being slowed in its journey towards the ocean by the presence of the Ross Ice Shelf. And if we zoom in, I think I've got a box to show that, yeah. This is the box. This is a surface velocity map of the ice flow over all of Antarctica in the corner, and the Ross Ice Shelf itself in the zoomed panel here. You can see how ice glaciers and ice streams coalesce in their flow to come out. Here's the grounding line, the white bit. So you've got grounded ice that is flowing from across the rock until it comes afloat, and there is ocean underneath the ice in this area. And then it speeds up because there's less friction for it, and it speeds up until it ultimately gets to the calving front and turns into icebergs and travels around with the circulation from there. One nice factoid to keep in mind is that from the grounding line to the calving front in the Ross Ice Shelf is about 1,000 years, the time it takes a packet of ice to travel, which means, and this will be important later, that there is about 1,000 years of the history of the ice sheet and the ice shelf recorded in the ice that has traveled through here. So there's about 1,000 years of history right here about to drop off into the ocean. One of the things we wanted to do was to try and interrogate that record and find out how stable this system has been in the past. And there are clues to its stability, even when you look at the ice thickness. So this is the ice thickness layer from BedMap 2. It actually derives the ice thickness from knowing that ice is floating and being able to take the surface elevation. But here you can see each of these little bent strands of thicker ice coming in that show where those glaciers have joined the ice shelf and coalesced into that apron and then traveled on. It's not directly following the velocity lines that we see for the present day. So we know that the history of the Ross Ice Shelf is not identical to its present behavior, but we want to understand in what way and why not. And of course, I've mentioned the ocean, and there's a lot of arrows on here, and we can talk about these kinds of circulations, but the point to this is that it is important that different water masses from the Southern Ocean can come in and travel underneath the ice shelf and affect melting at its grounding line, melting and refreezing at its base, and that these water masses are being steered. The grey blobs on this lower map are a representation of the bathymetry of the Ross Sea. So it's that rock layer, the bathymetry, that's steering the different water masses and really affecting the stability of the ice shelf. So we want to understand the ice shelf stability and history. We know that there's different components to that we need to understand. We want to be able to make predictions about it. And then this is the image of what we knew. In the 1970s, there was a major campaign that went out, it took several years, to try and map the seafloor beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. And it occupied each of these points. And these points for scale are about 55 kilometers apart. So you can hide a lot of seafloor in between these points where you've really no idea what the shape of it is. It was a really under-mapped part of the Earth's crust. And each of these points has been sounded by a seismic shot. So this is one of the seismic traces. I cannot remember from which point, but you can tell that you set off your explosives here. This is the first echo, and then this is the echo off the seafloor. So this is how the Ross Ice Shelf had been mapped up until we proposed this project, which said that if we want to understand the system, we need to see this map in more detail. And so we proposed to fly this grid, which has 10 kilometer spaced survey lines and 55 kilometer spaced tie lines that are aligned with the constraining points that were acquired back in the 70s. It's a very big ice shelf. It's about the size of either Texas or France, depending on what your metric is. And so airplanes are really the most effective way to cover that kind of area to map it. Steve mentioned that we met when we had been working in Antarctica on a land-based project where we were on the sea ice. And I was measuring gravity, and there was a seismic line being acquired to look at the stratigraphy beneath the seafloor. And that project gives you detail of what the seafloor looks like and what it's like underneath, but it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to cover quite a small area. So with the airplane, we have this system where we, for some parts of the system, we see less detail than we would if we were on the ground, but we're able to cover a much bigger area as we go. So we have a big team of people working from a tent that's directly based on the airfield at McMurdo. This is the airfield. So these are C-130 planes. They've got skis on them. They land on the ice. And here in this little corner, we have a pod of instruments that are able to measure different parts of that system and that are carried on the outside of the plane. On the inside of the plane, there's the computer that runs all of those systems and the operator who works them as well. So we've got this very mobile system that can measure the ice shelf, the ice shelf from the back of the plane. We also have these instruments inside the plane, and this is, I just can't resist talking about this because this is my favorite part of the whole project, is to identify the bathymetry by using the gravimeter. And again, Steve said that this is what I was doing on the ground 10 years ago, and it's really nice to be able to take it to the air. What this is doing is measuring acceleration due to gravity from the plane, which is quite a technological accomplishment in itself. And the acceleration due to gravity is responding to the topography of mostly the rock, since that's the densest thing beneath it, along the flight path of the plane. So where there is a ridge in the topography, there's more mass because there's more rock, so you'll get more gravity. Where there's a trough, you'll get less gravity. And so in places where it's difficult to measure the seafloor by any other means, radar can see it through the ice, where ice is grounded. Ships can see it through the water, where ships are able to go. But where you've got floating ice, like hundreds of meters thick ice shelf, radar will only show you the bottom of the ice, and ships can't get there. So gravity steps in to give you a sense of what kind of rock is down there. Now, one of the things you might know about rock is that it comes with different densities. So we have to understand something about the geology before we can do this trick of turning gravity into bathymetry. And this is the only slide I'll offer on this. You don't have to take it all in. But it was one of the big findings from this experiment that as we flew a magnetometer that measures the magnetic field from the plane as well, we saw that there's a really sharp difference in magnetic character from one side of the Ross Ice Shelf to the other. And we identified that that is because there's a really sharp difference in the lithology of the rocks. And in fact, we think that this is the boundary between East Antarctic rocks that have stretched and spread to make the lowland under the Ross Ice Shelf, and West Antarctic rocks that are stretched and spread as well. We could talk for a long time about that. I show it only to make sense of this map, which uses the known depth points from the RIGGS survey and the measured gravity from the Rosetta survey to figure out what the density of that crust must be. And it shows up that boundary once again, that we've got a denser side and a less dense side deep in the lithology of the lithosphere. And once we understand the geology, we can do the bathymetry trick. So this was the bathymetry under the Ross Ice Shelf as determined by the land-based surveys that you can see individual data points showing up in the map. And after the Rosetta surveys flew, this is the bathymetry model that we identified based on the gravity field. And the boundary that we found is there. It sort of shows up that this is the deeper side. The East Antarctic side has deeper bathymetry. The West Antarctic side has shallower bathymetry. But the really exciting part of this was that we were able to identify more detail in the bathymetry than we'd ever seen before. And particularly here near the grounding line, because we really want to know what happens when the ocean water comes up and touches that point where ice first goes afloat, because that's where the ice is first contributing its mass to the global sea level. And prior to this project, this was the BedMap 2 grid, and there just weren't constraints here. This shallow plane shows you that it's just an interpolation between the ridges on either side because there wasn't any other information to go by. And we were able to identify that the grounding line, the water cavity immediately offshore of the grounding line is much thicker, much deeper than we had reckoned before, which got us really excited because we thought, oh, that means that all of the models that we've been making to understand ocean interactions underneath the ice shelf, maybe there's a lot more going on at the grounding line than we thought. That's a teaser for what I'm about to show you in the rest of our results. But that's just the graphic to show circulation under the ice shelf, because that is what we will ultimately be modeling as part of this research. So from the field program, we flew most of that grid that I showed you, and we were able to build a picture of the full ice shelf system from it. So the ice surface that I showed you in a satellite-based map at the start, we now have from a LiDAR that was within the pod of instruments that we were flying. So this is the ice surface, and you can see those lines that show the changing thickness of ice as individual glaciers are feeding into the system. Did I say thickness? The ice surface we had from the LiDAR. We had a radar on board that's able to show the ice thickness. And so the radar goes through the full ice and bounces off the bottom here. And so we get a map of the base of the ice shelf as well. And that's the lid to this water cavity that we want to model. So that was an important thing to capture. And then from the seafloor bathymetry, this is the gravity model that's been integrated with the ship surveys and grounded ice radar surveys that have built up our picture of the Antarctic topography for this sector. So we come away with these key layers that define the edges of the system. But we want to understand what the ocean is doing in this cavity here. And that brings us on to the next component of the surveys. So I'm going to show this video, and I'm hoping that the sound won't play because it's really noisy in these planes. This was the next way that we could use the C-130s as a geophysical instrument, and it's for deployment of these sensors. So what just happened was that in that, I'm going to go back to the start. There we go. In this cardboard box, there is a sensor that can measure the temperature and the salinity of seawater. It gets air deployed into the patch of open water that we want to measure in. The box hits the water and the instrument gets out of it as the box disintegrates. And then it's been programmed to dive to a specific depth. And as it rises, it takes measurements of temperature and salinity. When it breaks the surface, I can go on to this point here. This is what the sensor looks like inside. This little antenna is able to email those data through the Iridium satellite network back to us. So we've got these sort of robot surveying floats that can send profile data back to us. And either the probes are set to always dive down to the depth of the seafloor and so stay more or less in place, or they're set to drift with the current at a certain depth. And so for the season, we deployed these in late November, early December, and then we were able to recover data from them all the way through that summer until the end of summer when the sea ice comes back over again and there's no more talking to us. So we deployed 6 of those sensors, and without going too far into the water mass properties, early in their deployment, they came up with the major water masses that we wanted to understand the processes of in this area. So each of these is a record of a single dive from one of these probes, and this is the temperature that we're showing. So a very shallow, warm water mass is the Antarctic surface water. It's going to be important later on. To have warm water that's a little bit deeper is the modified circumpolar deep water. So the water that circulates around Antarctica and kind of comes in at those mid depths as it travels over this part of the continental shelf. We've got ice shelf water, which you can see has a much colder component to it here because this is the melt. It's fresher, and it's the water that used to be ice shelf and is melted and is being exported from the system. And then this high salinity shelf water, which is also going to be kind of important, which here is fairly shallow, fairly warm. So what we did to put these elements together was to take the new bathymetry model, including the full definition of the cavity. So we're using the base of the ice shelf as well, and then running a model, a computer model that traces each of those water masses and where they would go if they're being steered by that kind of bathymetry. So I'll be able to play the model to you here. This is the high salinity shelf water that we're tracking. It's had dye put into it in the model, and we can see everywhere that it circulates, but I could do more of an explanation to you of how it forms. So this profile is running across the Ross Ice Shelf from the high plateau of East Antarctica. What we get here is katabatic winds, gravity-driven winds that are coming down from the very high elevation and cold area of the East Antarctic ice sheet. And they're blowing sea ice away from the edge of the ice shelf and making a polynya, which is an open water area, a persistent area of open water. What this is doing is the sea ice is concentrating fresh water at the surface, and that's being exported as the wind blows. So what you're doing is increasing the salinity of the water that's just offshore from the ice front. It then drops down because it's pretty cold but very saline, and is able to travel all the way through the ice shelf cavity back to the grounding line, and then it returns as the ice shelf water. On the other side, West Antarctica is not as high as East Antarctica. It's there's the Transantarctic Mountains are running through here and lifting that polar plateau, and the East Antarctic ice sheet is thicker than the West Antarctic ice sheet. So the katabatic winds have run their course more by the time they get to the front. So there is less generation of high salinity shelf water on this side. And this area is mostly just full of ice shelf water. So you can see that the high salinity shelf water is very much forming on the East Antarctica side of the ice shelf here, circulating around, getting all the way to the grounding line, but not much of it is showing up on the West Antarctic side. That means that if you were to take this cross section, which tracks just in front of the grounding line all the way around the ice shelf, you get a cavity that's filled with high salinity shelf water here and filled with ice shelf water on this side. So two different kinds of cavity on either side, but fairly stable water masses that are melting the ice shelf, but not changing very much. That's a summary of the two sides. So the next water mass that we wanted to look at was the modified circumpolar deep water. That's the stuff that I mentioned before. It's going around the edge of the continental shelf. It's traveling here, and where it's able to, it rises up onto the continental shelf and will go as far as it is able to underneath the ice shelf. This is the water mass that we hear about a lot in the Amundsen Sea. It's doing a lot of the melting of Thwaites and Pine Island glaciers. Here in the Ross Sea, you can see it again being steered by the topography of the sea and really not making a huge amount of progress into the East Antarctic side of the ice shelf and getting about a third of the way back on the West Antarctic side, and that's about as far as it goes. So this again is the West Antarctic side. The circumpolar deep water goes this far, melts at the front of the ice shelf, but then meets this cavity full of ice shelf water and can't get much farther. On the East Antarctic side, it's doing the same thing, it's crossing the shelf, but then it's meeting not only ice shelf water, but also this high salinity shelf water. And so it makes very little progress into this side at all. So the processes that are important in the Amundsen Sea don't seem to be the ones that would be driving the Ross Ice Shelf system anytime in the near future. So what is driving that system? For this, we contend with the problem that oceanographers see the world the other way up to the rest of us. So I've had to rotate this figure from Porter et al. From last year, because it was originally with north upwards. So I've turned it so that south is still upwards in the plot. And each of these blue streaks show where those oceanographic floats traveled to in the time that they were deployed. And we're going to look at the readout from just two of them because it shows you the phenomenon that sets up the important water mass. And so these are the two. This is a temperature plot, and this is a plot of the salinity. And these are drawn from a sequence of dives that were performed at different days, you know, on a sort of 3-day beat through the season, so that we could see how the water masses in that area were evolving. The thing that's important for the talk that I want to give is watching this red layer, which is the warmer temperature, get deeper through the season. So what's happening is that you have open water, the sun is shining on it 24 hours a day, and you're putting heat into the ocean, and this surface layer is warming up and thickening as it warms. Towards the end of the season, that does start to cool off again. This kind of erodes away, but it's this thickening that I'm particularly interested in. If you are interested in the ocean and want to dig into Porter et al., you'll also find other interesting signals, like the fact that these floats also showed a freshening as we went through the season. And there was more fresh water seen by those floats than you would expect from just the melting of the Ross Ice shelf. So it looks like these floats have picked up the signal of melting upstream, which is in the Amundsen Sea. Meltwater has been coming around the corner and into the Ross Sea, which is what's seen here. So that's a cool result. But read that paper to find out more about it. For this paper and this talk, I want to show you what happens when that surface layer deepens the way it does and carries that heat into the ice shelf. Ooh. No, I really do. There we go. So this is the diagram that's tracking that surface layer, and this is the part that's important. This is a 3-year simulation. So every summer, you see that the surface layer water expands and intrudes under the ice shelf here. That puts these colors onto this map. This is an average summer melt rate that shows the bright reds where there's most melting, which is this sort of tongue of fire that extends out from the corner of Ross Island. Our flights were parked here in the evenings. And this is the process that's happening. So you saw that layer thickening through the season. And on the West Antarctic side, it does thicken through the season, but the ice is quite thick here, and it doesn't get enough to get underneath the ice shelf and do much harm. On the East Antarctic side, the ice is thinner anyway. We saw that in our radar surveys, and there's more open water. And so the surface water thickens down until it's able to intrude underneath the ice shelf and melt quite a lot. Like that's 10 meters per year worth of melt that's being predicted by the model here. So it's a fairly strong process of melting, just in a very focused area at the front of the ice shelf. And we wanted to understand how the ice shelf feels about that. Is this a stable process? You can have high melt, but if you've got high ice flow coming into an area to replenish all the material that's being removed from the base, then you're fine. But we know that there have been changing flow patterns in the Ross Ice Shelf over the last millennium. We can see that when we look at the surface. So we wanted to understand if this was a stable process or not. And we have satellite records that have observed basal melt rates for the Ross Ice Shelf over a decade or so. And we wanted to be able to use our survey to look further back. So this is where the radar profiles come in, and this is kind of neat. So this is a full ice shelf transect that goes right the way across the ice shelf on this flight line here. And the radargram, the dark layer here is the surface of the ice. This layer at the bottom, that's showing you the base of the ice. We can pick out each of the individual ice streams as they've been contributed, as they contribute their own ice to this. And there is an internal reflector that you can distinguish in the radargrams that's separating ice that flowed from an ice stream across the grounding line into the ice shelf and ice that formed by snow falling on top of that surface. So once the ice shelf was formed and flat, it continues to snow on it, and that builds up some of the volume of ice that is the ice shelf. So it's growing from the top as it flows from the grounding line to the calving front. And it can grow from the bottom, and it can also melt from the bottom, depending on what the ocean's doing. What we did was just to focus in on this corner that we're interested in because of those melt rates. And we're going to take 3 radar lines that are 20 kilometers downstream from each other in sequence. And consider that to be a snapshot of what would be the same configuration of ice, just 20 kilometers of flow further downstream. So it's like a time series of what this ice looks like. And this is between Bird and Mullock glaciers. You can see the internal reflector there. I go 20 kilometers further, and that's where the reflector used to be. This is where it is now. It's lower. 20 kilometers further downstream from that, and it's actually hit the bottom. All of the Bird ice or Mullock ice that was here further upstream has been melted away. So this column of ice is exclusively made of snowfall after the glacier ice had passed the grounding line. And what that shows us is that we've removed at least 75 meters of ice from the bottom of the ice shelf in that corner over the 82 years that it would take to flow from the first line to the third line that we're looking at. And that implies a basal melt rate. The ice should be converging here. We've taken other reasons that thickness might change out of this calculation, but it suggests a basal melt rate of about 0.9 meters per year, which is in fact exactly the same as what was observed by the ICESat satellite between 2003 and 2009. So it seems that while this is quite a dramatic process that's removing glacial ice from the bottom of the ice shelf, it appears to have been running at the same rate in the satellite era and in the century or so before that, which is kind of cool. Now that was one nice illustration where you can see each of the radargrams and you can track that, that horizon yourself. Indrani Das published this year to look at the whole ice shelf and try and trace that horizon from line to line over the entirety of the Rosetta survey. And she found the same high melt rates in this corner near Ross Island, and then identified other hotspots along the front, which largely correspond with melting processes that model described quite well in ways that the ocean is melting the bottom of the ice shelf here. So to summarize what that means for the stability of the ice shelf, near the grounding line, we had this profile. So this is ice shelf water that's not melting anything near the grounding line. We had high salinity shelf water. It is melting at quite a high rate, but it's being formed, that's the one that's being formed by the katabatic winds that are really being set up by that fundamental geometry of a massive ice sheet on East Antarctica. So that's a pretty stable process. And we expect that in the near term, the grounding line in this area probably isn't going to change all that much. So the new bathymetry that we saw that showed it was deeper than we ever thought it was before, there still doesn't seem to be much of a pathway for really warm water and these other water masses from the front to get back there. Instead, what we found as the changeable processes in this system was really this key corner, because the surface water, its volume, its temperature is being determined by how much open water there is in any given season for the sun to shine on and heat up. And that's affected by sea ice cover, that's affected by cloud cover, that's affected by all sorts of parts of the system that might reasonably be expected to change on fairly short time scales. So there's high melt in both parts of the system, but the front is the changeable part. So that we identified as being the biggest vulnerability of this system, was melting from changes in the surface water. And that matters. This very focused local process matters because there have been calculations done on the flow and the strength of this ice shelf and identified a safety band, an area that, that the ice is so stretched that it's not really even pushing back on the ice sheet anymore. So you could lose ice in theory from this safety band and not much affect the grounded ice around it. But this little corner is outside that safety band. And Rees et al. A couple of years ago now identified what would happen if you increased melting in this corner. And it increases ice flow right the way across the ice shelf and all the way to the West Antarctic grounding line, all along the East Antarctic grounding line. Changes in this area have consequence all the way around the ice shelf. And we've identified that the process that is that's controlling those changes is a changeable one. Now, I'm watching the time, and I think I'm going to go for this one extra thought so that you'll have it and you can ask questions about it if you want. But we also spent a little bit of time thinking about the long-term stability of the Ross Ice Shelf. So in the short term, we think that it's most vulnerable to increased melting in that bottom right corner. In the long term, there must be a different interplay between these processes. It's interesting and important because a lot of the large ice sheet models that show how Antarctica has changed, the ice sheets have changed in the past and predict what's going to happen in the future, have been tuned to sediment records, the like of which Andril recovered and Steve was working on when we first met. So the sediment records that exist in this corner have been used to make sure that the models of the full ice sheet are correct. And so if the processes controlling whether there's ice or not in this area aren't what we thought they were, or if they change over time, that's going to have consequence for how we match models to sediment records. So that's a pretty important thing. And what we figured out was that this is the situation that we're looking at the moment for winter time melting and setting up for this surface water melting on the East Antarctic side of the Ross Ice Shelf. So the high salinity shelf water is the thing that is getting to the grounding line. It is blocking the circumpolar water from getting in. I showed you that in one of the videos. So the process that's active in the Amundsen Sea at the moment doesn't work on that side of the Ross Ice Shelf because you've got katabatic winds that are controlling other water masses. If you go back to the last glacial maximum, where the ice sheet was larger and the grounding line was closer to the continental shelf, that won't have been the case anymore. It's reasonable to think that katabatic winds might have lost some of their power by the time they get to the front. Even if they didn't, the polynya that they're making won't just pour high salinity shelf water in to fill this cavity. It'll be more distributed because it's out over the continental shelf edge. So as a thought experiment, we kind of figured out that the circumpolar deep water must be able to reach the grounding line at times when the grounding line is very close to the continental shelf edge. And in fact, Doug McHale had been talking about this in the 80s. So this is sort of understood that there's this configuration when you've got a very large ice sheet, this configuration under the present ice sheet. And that means that at some point in the retreat of the grounding line, the controlling factors on what's controlling the ice shelf must have switched. And whether that's a sudden process or whether that's a slow process, whether there's an element of what the topography on East Antarctica that the katabatic winds are coming off might play a component of it, all of that is still to be understood. But by seeing how the system today works, it shows the importance, I think this will show up in the next slide, it shows the importance of local processes, that the confluence of winds and water masses, the thickness of the ice and the shape of the seafloor is, can direct melting processes into important and precise corners of the ice shelf. And those processes are hard to get into numerical models, where it's easier just to sort of dial up the temperature of the ocean and see how the ice physics responds. So this is really a call to say that the local processes and the specific configurations of those bodies through time are going to be really important if we want to be able to make good reconstructions of how the ice sheets behaved in the past. That's going to be important for making good predictions of what it's going to do in the future. Which brings me straight to my conclusions, which that for the ocean side, the profiling floats show the seasonal changes in the shallow water, which are warming and freshening. And the decadal scale basal melt rates are steered by those and are consistent with what we see from the satellite era. The local and regional processes that control the melting are really important to understand better if we want to make predictions of this area. And the only way to do that is to have these sorts of interdisciplinary studies. And so we had glaciologists, we had oceanographers, we had geologists, we had pilots and radar engineers all working on this program, and those are all essential if you want to get this kind of thing done. And this is a thank you to all of those people, and I mentioned that yes, it's also quite useful to have people who are working on the sediments so that we can understand the history of this ice sheet. Okay, thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Kirsty. Wow. I learned a lot just now about that. And so, we both lived on the sea ice, and the details you provided was amazing. So, so I would like to open it up to questions. So some people may want to just type in your question, or you can use your microphone, either way. So does anybody have some questions to begin with? So, okay. I'll ask a question because you know me. So let me turn on the video so you can see me as well. And so anyway, so the internet did come back on eventually. Oh, so good. Yeah, that's so anyway. So so you know, so lots of amazing information and understanding about the circulation patterns. What does that say about the future?
What does that say about the future? You always have to have a picture in front of you if you want to talk about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to decide which one is the right one. What it says to me, because I might not find the right picture, is that I expect that those that we are going to get more warm, shallow water in that corner in the future. I expect that we can see a reduction in buttressing power all around the Ross Ice Shelf becoming, and I should have maybe made it clearer that at the moment with the satellite observations that we have, the Ross Ice Shelf is considered to be stable. It's big, it's cold cavity, it's not changing very much, but we know from geological records that it has collapsed before. So it's not as vulnerable to the changing circumpolar deep water as we've seen, but I do expect that we're going to see increased melt in that corner. Okay. And what is interesting after that is how the flow will reshuffle itself. So you thin that area. I showed the Reese image of flow increasing everywhere, but as the flow is faster, the ice will get thinner, the cavity will get bigger, and it's possible that the balance, this is exactly the wrong slide to have in front of me, but anyway, it's possible that the balance between these different water masses is going to shift a little bit. Because what would be really interesting would be to know under what circumstances can this water intrude any farther and get it at the West Antarctic grounding line. And if you thin here, which I think is what's going to happen next, and speed up here, at what point do you suddenly kind of open the back door and warm water starts coming in from another side? So I can imagine a world where that could happen. This on the decadal scale, this on, I don't know. Let's have somebody model that, please.
Because, you know, we're, you know, people like geologists, we think on much longer time scales. So, it's, but, you know, actually, let me take a step backwards real quick. So how thick, you know, you talked about 80 meters of ice thinning, right? Or something like that.
Yep.
And how thick is the ice sheet? Is the ice shelf?
Let's see. At the front there, it's about 450 meters. Well, in the middle here, it's about 450 meters thick.
Okay, so we're
at the front, it's about 300 meters thick.
Okay, so we're talking about maybe a third to a quarter of thinning took place. Okay.
Yeah, and it's been snowing on top of it as well. So that's removal of material from the base, but not necessarily thinning because there's been snow to replenish that. So that's another balance and a component of this project that we just didn't have fully integrated from the start, and discovered as we went along how important it would be that the atmosphere, it's driving the winds that are controlling the formation of the water masses, but also if precipitation patterns shift around here, we're getting a handle on the basal melt, but to understand the surface mass balance as well is the other side of that trick.
Yeah.
Oh, and another thing that I find kind of wonderful about this is this image where the ice shelf is here completely made of snow that fell on the ice shelf. That material has a different strength than the ice that has been kind of mashed up through a glacier and crevassed and squished and forced through the transantarctic mountains. So we have folk on the team who are like material scientists who are interested in the strength of the ice and how that in itself, before you even change the melting rates, but just by melting a different material, how will that change the flow? Which is kind of cool.
Okay, great, thank you. So we got some, now we got some questions. First one's from Inva. So based on the data collected in this study, is there any indication that ice shelf instability is affected by the ocean warm water? And what kind of response do we expect to see if that happens?
And then the next line.
Oh no, there's just, so she says, this was just answered by for me. Okay, so.
Excellent question.
Yeah.
Let me know if anything in the answer didn't make sense.
And so, okay, so let's see, Godfrey, why is it that the mixture of high salinity seawater and ice shelf water does not cross the tectonic boundary? What water is trapped in that thin column on the opposite side of the boundary? And does density of the waters play a role here?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I wonder if I've got a good graphic or if I'll just say. We had a lot of internal fights with ourselves as to what extent the deep, like the crustal structure tectonic boundary, like does that really matter to this two-sided part of the question? It does, in the extent that the different types of crust correspond to different types of stretching, correspond to the deep East Antarctic side and the shallow West Antarctic side. So that's the tectonic boundary is showing up in the bathymetry. And that asymmetry will always have been there, like always in ice sheet terms. So it's really set itself up for that. And then exactly what you're thinking about the water that's trapped in the thin column on the West Antarctic side, that is, that's the water that melted from the bottom of the ice shelf. So there is, this one in front of me will do nicely enough. There is basal melting that's happening everywhere that this ice shelf isn't white in this map. So fresh water that comes from molten ice sheet comes around and pools in this fairly stagnant area. It's thin, and there aren't particularly impressive gradients of changing thickness of ice column. So there's not a lot of circulation happening on this side. So as the ice shelf melts in contact with the ocean, the fresh water kind of pools and fills that area. And it is the thinness of the water column there and the fact that the seafloor is shallower that allows that pooling to happen. And that's what rebuffs the high salinity shelf water that really is being steered by the seafloor bathymetry all the way back here to the grounding line. So it's melted ice shelf that is stopping it from getting to the West Antarctic side. I'm reading Max's question myself here.
Stephen, you're muted.
Duh. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So the question for Max is about the different types of water. Why are the deep polar water and the high salinity shelf water different? And shouldn't the deep water be more saline further from the ice mass?
Okay, I will do my best to answer this because the story of the ice shelf is an oceanographic story and I'm a geologist. But they're separate because they do form differently. So the circumpolar deep water is what is circulating around Antarctica, and we only see it on the shelf where it's able to sort of come up over the edge and intrude through a little way. It does that because it's warm, and that makes it somewhat buoyant. And I love the question that the deep water being farther from the ice should be able to have more salinity. That makes sense as a process, since we just talked about the fresh water that comes from the melting ice. But the formation of that high salinity water has its own way of concentrating salt. It forms in the polynya. It forms by basically taking all the fresh water and solidifying it into sea ice. Well, that happens anyway. But by blowing it away, you are preferentially removing fresh water from the place that is very near the edge of the ice shelf, because that's where the winds first catch the water and are able to, so they remove the fresh water that's in the sea ice. And that's what concentrates the salinity of the high salinity shelf water right near the edge. So whatever water mass was there before the wind started blowing has a salinity, and that's sort of normal salinity, and then that gets concentrated. So that's why you can get such high saline material near the freshwater source of the melting ice sheet, because those two aren't mixing so much.
Okay, wow. So, so I have another question, and it's actually from Inva, who actually read your paper. Okay, so it's so in your paper it suggested that the local ocean currents play a significant role in the ice shelf retreat. Are the local currents affected seasonally only?
That's a great question. Their influence is definitely very different seasonally. So you're not, well, you can form those water masses at different times of year, but now we really do need to look at the floats. There we go. Because the high salinity shelf water is forming most when you've got active production of sea ice. So you're solidifying the fresh water and you're getting rid of it. So that's really a wintertime process. Once you're not making sea ice anymore, you don't have the same mechanism to concentrate the salinity. So that is a winter process. This shallow water process, you need open water for the sun to shine on in order to make that. And you get that when you don't have sea ice cover. So yeah, it's a really seasonal process, and this is what I wanted to see here, that you almost don't see it at the start when we put this in quite late December, and then it grows and grows and grows all through January and all through to about the middle of February. And then you can see that layer beginning to get eroded away. Sea ice is starting to form again here, I think, and the lid's coming back on. So the heat's being lost and you don't have that shallow layer anymore. So yeah, the local processes are very seasonal in which water masses you get formed at any particular time. We were still able to identify all of those masses when we were just measuring in the summer. And so the high salinity shelf water is still there at depth. And actually the oceanographers were really touchy about this, that this is a summertime basal melt rate, and it looks different from the integrated all year round one. But we're really kind of homing in on these processes to get them more precisely understood in their geography and also in their timing. So a thing that is maybe only important, that intrusion in here only happens in the summer, but it shows up in the century scale record of the ice sheet. So seasonal processes that have long-term consequences on the stability of the ice shelf.
Kirsty, before we move on to the next one in the chat, I think Godfrey threw up his hand.
Ooh.
So let's hear from him. He might have one that's relevant to what you just said.
Yes, I have one quick question. While I was looking at the introduction of the paper, I saw that the East Antarctic ice shelf suffers from basal ice melt as well as calving, but the West suffers more from ice loss as a result of carving. Why is that?
That's a fantastic question. That is an observation that's been made from the satellite calculations. And I'm trying to remember which way round it goes and why there is more carving on that one side. It's more carving on the east, yes?
No, west.
The other way around? Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what that process is. It's thicker on the west side. So I guess you can melt away a lot more volume on the thin. If you calve icebergs that are 20 kilometers deep, the thicker ice is going to remove more volume.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure that that's exactly the right answer. There could be really interesting elements of ice mechanics, because you can see rifts that go all the way back through this ice shelf here. But yeah, that'll be my first guess, back of the envelope explanation for that calculation. Good question, thanks.
Yes, sure. Okay, so well, we have a couple more questions from students, actually. So this is from Amanda. So in your paper, it mentions that the asymmetry prevents basal melt rates from changing substantially for future moderate changes to climate. If there are more extreme changes in climate, what do you think will happen with the basal melt rate?
This feeds in, I think, this feeds to that idea of what happens if you're able to melt that thicker ice more. Because we've been looking just at the most vulnerable things in the thin on the bottom right corner, but this idea of lifting the lid on the West Antarctic side, I think that is a process that could perhaps occur under more dramatic changes, because I'm thinking about the Amundsen Sea, and the incursion of circumpolar deep water onto the continental shelf is associated with winds and you know, how much energy there is that shoves it over. So if you tip that end of the system, which isn't even the part that we've been looking at, and send more warm water onto the shelf, that could have a big effect. Also, there are other processes that we have looked at in this area that aren't so much part of this story, but that might be able to play a role in larger changes in the climate. And I'm thinking about surface hydrology on ice shelves, because if you go up the coast here a little ways to the Nansen ice shelf, we've seen water pooling on the surface of that, a waterfall flowing off the edge of it. And there is surface water that forms in the transantarctic. So maybe if you had certain kinds of larger scale shift, then you would bring in whole other processes that would need to be considered in predicting the stability of this. And that's important on geological timescales too, that, you know, sometimes there's a totally different process to kick in at some point.
Excellent question again. So I think we have one more question. At least. This is from Robert. So does the east-west bedrock difference stretch across the continent? And would that imply ice shelves on opposite from the Ross have the same split between intruding shelf waters and ice waters?
Yeah, I love that question because I really want to know. This is that boundary as we have drawn it, and you can see there's a lot of not sure over here on the Filchner-Ronne, which is the other big ice shelf in Antarctica. It's also cold cavity. There have been studies that talk about warm water being able to get in on this side, kind of similar, although they were looking at the circumpolar deep water and how that goes in. So it's tantalizing and entirely possible. But what we've really learned from here is that it's the full configuration of where you are. It's the height of the plateau. It's the thinness of the ice. It's the channels on the seafloor that build together to give us this understanding of process. So yeah, that question just makes me want to go and fly another survey and try and understand that ice shelf completely as well.
Excellent. And so Well, okay, so are there any more questions? Well, there are a lot of comments about that everyone, whether it's faculty or students, learned a lot. So let's have another applause. A great talk, Kirsty. Thank you so much. And amazing slides. In a movie on top of that, like when you were putting out the instruments out of the airplane, I'm going, doesn't get much cooler or amazing than that. So well done.
Yeah, it's an amazing place to work, and the things you have to do to get the data home, whole other stories of themselves. But yeah, I really like these projects.
I want to be a bit surprised that because I saw about 8 or 10 of my students just and I have a feeling that they're going to ask, is there any chance we could work with Kirsty or Dr. Tinto?
That could happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic when the world comes back, and
Exactly.
we're craving more data coming from this area. There's a load of work still to be done. I love looking at BedMap too. You've seen that when you've come to the lab, and seeing all the spaces and all the things that we still don't know, and each one of them has these integrated, complicated problems attached to them. And yeah, that's why it's exciting to see so many students here. And please come and
And there's always a demand for people who will do hard things.
yeah, there really is.
It's easy to find work if you'll do something hard.
Oh, I might print that out and stick it on the wall.
Well said. And so anyway, so as people start leaving, so Kirsty, thanks again. That was great. And I actually learned, this was better than, chatting with you for 5 minutes. I learned so much what you're doing.
If we were sitting around, I would just chat and get distracted by anecdotes, but it's nice to get to tell the science story.
So I guess this season was canceled, I guess, right?
Yeah, we didn't have, we're starting work now to actually get some more time spent looking at data, which is kind of exciting because we didn't have a field season planned, but the big Thwaites season, that joint US-UK endeavor, it's had its field work affected a lot by this year, and a lot of reimagining going on, but we'll be back.
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. I figure one more year, and we'll be back.
Yeah.
Keep our fingers crossed, of course.
Yes.
Among other things.
Yes, but so far we've been going out frantically collecting data for the 10 years that I've been here, and it's no bad thing to sit down and get to look at it again. Actually, I don't know if there's anybody still here, but there was one thing that I was going to show you, because I think there's real value in just going through these data and having more brains thinking about them. And I had this slide showing that all the data from Rosetta, like all the data from IceBridge as well, it's all available on the web, and so there's a lot of scope for designing new surveys and making new discoveries with these giant data sets that we've got, because they certainly haven't been tapped out for new understandings. And it would be really fun to do some more work on them and come up with some new plans for when the world comes back.
Excellent. Yeah.
So what you're saying is if we had a few students who had learned how to use Geosoft.
Yeah. Then we'd have a whole bunch of discoveries that they could make, and then we could all make a plan and make some more measurements. That's what I'm saying.
That sounds like a little collaboration right there. So
I think that would be a hoot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so so actually my battery is running down now, because I was running around the building looking for some place of internet, and I found it in my office, or it just maybe it just came back, but whatever. And so so anyway, so I'm about to run out, so unfortunately I got to cut off. Okay, so but Kirsty, it was great seeing you. When things get better, we definitely need to meet up in the city or up at Lamont or whatever.
Yeah.
When this all is over.
I'll be delighted. In the meantime,
No,
Zoom
yeah.
has been a real friend, hasn't it? So I'm glad that this was still possible.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, sure. You know, it's incredible. You know, we met a dozen years ago or something like that. So, and here you are in New York. So,
Yeah.
it's a-
And Dax, I know you mostly through Zoom, so.
Oh, well, I bet say we've been preparing for the pandemic for years in my discipline. So the you know the Zoom meeting is
Look
was
at you now.
the
You
industry
know.
standard. I'm excited to actually be back on campus at whatever point we can be.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so I'm down to 10% now. So,
Okay. Yeah.
okay. So Kirsty, great. Let's stay in touch. And when things are better, maybe in this next summer. Okay. Manhattan. Okay.
Sometime in the next couple of weeks, let's you and I just catch up on a sidebar.
I'd love that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That'd be
You
really
got
good.
I'll show you.
So-
And thanks everybody else for coming along. It was great to see the questions and see the names, and I'd love to get to meet everybody at some point.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. So, well, you know, next time you'll come down and give another talk, but you'll do it in person next time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We would love to show the campus.
Awesome.
Absolutely. And,
Okay.
okay, well, we'll take care. And Dax, let's talk in about 15 minutes. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, take care, guys.
Good luck with the roofers.
Bye-bye.
So long.